if some of you guys are wondering on the fact that I did not review this episode as part of Cartoon Crisis 2 of last November, it's mainly the fact that there were other episodes worse than this episode, and it's the fact that I have less knowledge of this episode since I put my focus on the other episodes I was familiar with through the last several months while doing the videos of Cartoon Crisis 2. But after doing a rewatch of this episode for preparation for this video, I can honestly tell that this episode is way more insulting than I give it credit. And back then, I did not even laugh whatsoever after watching this episode multiple times as a child. And that is saying something when you're a little kid and completely did not find any of this funny despite the fact that you had less knowledge of what is actually going on in an episode as a child. The episode begins with Blue getting caught by Mr. Hellman after dismantling a vehicle. And this is where we get to see how unfairly punished Blue gets in this entire episode. The look on his face in the screenshot that I'm showing, it really shows that he isn't surprised that he got caught. And this was a time where the flannelization from Blue has begun. But in this episode alone, you actually feel bad for him. If people are going to discuss that this is the punishment that he deserves after he put Frankie through miserable imposter's home for makeup pills, which is an episode that came out before this episode, then no, it really doesn't. Because for one, Blue wasn't a main character in that episode, and his motivations in that episode was for the sake of having the plot going forward. In this, he's trying his best to get into trouble so that he won't be able to eat anything that Frankie makes. Because without carrots, Frankie won't be able to make a really good dish for so many imaginary friends. So instead, Madame Foster forces her to make a really disgusting dish that is good for everyone, but at the same time, it's so vile. Yeah, I know I said vile, but that's basically what you can describe of what Frankie makes throughout this entire episode. And in all honesty, I honestly think the punishment that Blue gets in this is honestly undeserved. If you're going to say that it's mainly the fact that he dismantled a bus, Mr. Hellman said that he will let him off the hook. And believe me when I say this is that Mr. Hellman's carrot addiction is the reason onto why Blue doesn't get punished whatsoever. But I'm gonna get to that very soon. About Mr. Hellman's carrot addiction, I understand, he's a rabbit, and rabbits love carrots, but here's the thing. Whoever he encounters any of the residents in Foster's, he completely punishes them for almost insignificant things. And this leads to how Blue is just doing worse things intentionally, but he doesn't get any punishment whatsoever. Here's something that I just don't like from Mr. Hellman in this episode. Even though that he isn't hateable when it comes to his treatment towards other characters, and in this episode he instantly punished the imaginary friends over something that isn't worth punishing for, his carrot addiction on the ideal of having the other characters thinking that they're gonna have his carrots is honestly really uncalled for. Now, I understand that addiction is a really important topic, and it's something that some people, mainly Mr. Hellman, cannot handle by destroying. However, the fact that he instantly punched anyone that had nothing to do with his carrots addiction, didn't even bother to have any carrots whatsoever just before supper time, honestly makes his behavior in this really uncalled for, and the fact that he's just instantly punished with the other characters for the sake of something that they did not do in the first place. When this episode's called Crime After Crime and it involves Blue just trying to get into trouble, but at the same time it didn't end up happening, it really makes everything that he does in this really stupid whenever you could look at this episode again and again. And believe me when I say this, Mr. Hellman in this episode, despite being not one of his worst appearances in the entire show, really makes you feel that his motivations of his carrot addiction honestly goes way over the top than you actually expect. If you didn't watch this episode and you're gonna be watching this episode, then I warn you that his motivations in this episode is honestly one of his worst. And what I mean by that is the fact that his character, who isn't strictly, becomes way more psychotic. I know addicted people can't be psychotic in these situations, but when you completely see Mr. Hellman just trying to avoid anything in the surroundings in Foster's and not in a haunted house, then his behavior in this is honestly over the top if you ask me. So anyway, let's go talk about Blue in this episode, because my god, he gets the most miserable treatment in any other episode, in my opinion. It may be debatable, but I haven't gotten to those episodes yet. Like I mentioned, Blue wants to do everything he can to not eat supper, so he tries to do multiple things to get into trouble. Compared to what he does in other episodes because of his flannelization, in this episode, he is trying to get into trouble so that he doesn't actually get to eat supper tonight. And when you completely see a character like him doing this kind of stuff, and he has actual motivations, and compared to his motivations in the other episodes, you can really tell that the writers try way too hard for you to sympathize Blue, but also want to see him get punishment at the end, despite the fact that the execution in this episode is done very badly. Let me talk about the idea of what this episode is trying to do. It's trying to have a character do something intentionally bad, but for somehow the other character doesn't even see the issues that Blue does and just completely thanks him because of their addiction. Let me tell you this. How can Mr. Hellman instantly thank Blue after the terrible things that he did to him in this entire episode? Let's get into one of the things that Blue did in this episode, mainly the last three that he did against Mr. Hellman. When Mr. Hellman takes the carrots into his office, Blue put entire jello inside of his office, preventing him to get inside. And he actually thanked Blue so that he can actually find a different place to stash his carrots. Seriously, how is this thanking Blue in any other way when in reality Blue's just wanted to get into trouble? This is the type of stuff that Mr. Hellman's office needs to be cleaned because Blue put an entire block of jello inside of Mr. Hellman's office. Seriously, if something like this happens in any other cartoon, the main character who caused this action will instantly go be sent to the room. And let's get into the second prank that Blue did that caused Hellman to almost getting killed. And yes, I know what I just said, because while Mr. Hellman was trying to run away from Eduardo, who he thinks it's a monster attacking him, Blue eats bananas and put banana peels on the floor. And Mr. Hellman slips on one of the banana peels and falls down through flights of stairs. Tell me, there is no difference when it comes to attacking the monster or falling on a flight of stairs of almost getting killed. Because as far as I'm concerned, the fact that Mr. Hellman thanks Blue for instantly getting away from the monster is honestly unrealistic writing. Just because this is a cartoon doesn't mean that any of this is excusable. Because of what Mr. Hellman does in this episode, because of his character addiction, really makes everything what Blue does in this episode honestly hard to watch. Believe me, when you see Blue doing this kind of stuff and the fact that he's the main character in this episode, really shows that the writers are trying desperately in order to have Blue avoid getting into trouble to get some kind of punishment at the end of the episode. But for how this episode is executed, they fail on delivering that ideal. And the third and final stunt that he does in this episode is using a wrecking ball. People may discuss on how he finds a wrecking ball, but I can accept cartoon logic like this. So he uses a wrecking ball to destroy a window of Madame Foster's apartment, and then this happens. Mr. Hellman actually saw Eduardo hanging from the ceiling after jumping on the bed, and he thanks Blue again. Seriously, how is this easily hilarious whenever you completely look at Blue being mistreated in this? If people are supposed to say you shouldn't take this episode seriously because it's a cartoon, then how can you accept the fact that Blue uses a whacking ball, destroying one building of one house, and then honestly goes off scot-free despite the fact that it wasn't his intentional motivations? It doesn't work like that. Whoever actually sees this when it comes to having a home that is supposed to be private and undamaged will instantly snap no matter what. Seriously, we've seen this before in Season 2. Well, Mr. Hellman and Frankie are upset that one of the windows are destroyed. And that was in Everything Knows It's Bendy. And believe me when I say this, is that when an episode that's considered bad had an interesting scene that did much more better than this scene, then that is saying a lot. I don't know about you, but every bit of writing I've seen in this episode when it comes to the other characters isn't really worth it. Seriously. Wilt thinking that he's in trouble despite the fact that he's an imaginary friend and he doesn't know any better and just gets sent to jail but decide to have supper at the end doesn't really excuse everything in this episode because of how mistreated Blue gets. And then when Mac heads to Foster's, because this is the time where Mac actually has to head to Foster's for every single day, Blue desperately wants Mac to get him into trouble. And if you saw this episode before, you saw the scene where Blue was jumping on the mattress. And I've already shown you the screenshot of it a few minutes ago. And what does Mac have in store on trying to get Blue into trouble? By jumping on a mattress that Blue did in this episode. And I have to admit, the line that Blue made in this episode is actually worth it. I cannot believe we'll relay it. I have to admit, that line actually is worth it while watching this episode. So Blue has no other choice by stealing jewelry from Madame Foster's drawer, and Frankie, who was making the dish, punishes Mac by sending them out. Not to mention that Blue actually put the jewels inside of Mac's backpack. When Frankie kicks out Mac, he saw that there's jewelry inside and the police arrived because Mr. Hellman called the police station on the fact that 100 carats have been stolen. This episode honestly makes the shoehorn Mac subplot honestly hammered in, because as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to episodes that didn't have Mac for the majority of it, the imaginary friends honestly have to carry the episode on their own, and even if it may be a good thing, in some exceptions with this episode, it just doesn't work. Now look, I understand that Frankie went through a lot of stress into making the dish that Madame Foster forces her to make. And it is understandable on the fact that she would instantly put out her frustration on Mac, thinking that he was the child that was been jumping on the bed the entire time. However, isn't she aware that Mac just arrived at night, which was at a time where Mac doesn't usually arrive at Foster's during the daytime? Mac pretty much had other things to do during the meantime, and the fact that she actually kicks Mac out thinking that he is the one who was jumping on the bed the entire time, isn't she aware that Mac doesn't live here, and the fact that he's only here for Blue? I can get that the fact that Frankie went through a lot of stress into making the dish, but the fact that Mac is in a situation that Blue unintentionally put him into, Frankie really needs to actually talk to Madame Foster about the dish itself, because as far as I'm concerned, that's basically the issue of what this entire episode is. It's just trying to make the dish completely awful, but at the same time forcing people to eat it because they don't have carrots. Tell me, watching this episode from beginning to end of how Mr. Hellman unfairly punished people for what they did unintentionally over something that they did not even bother onto doing because it's something that people usually do inside of a house, and what I mean by that is the rug incident that Mr. Hellman is exaggerating with, and then him completely accusing Coco from stealing carrots despite the fact that Coco didn't do anything whatsoever on stealing carrots. Seriously. The fact that Mr. Hellman is so crazy when it comes to his carrot addiction, it really goes to show that in later episodes we don't get to see his addiction ever again. Granted, I haven't seen all the episodes in later seasons, but just by watching this episode, I think it really shows of how everything this episode is just stressful to sit through. And if I actually did review this episode of Part of Cartoon Crisis 2, I will probably review a different episode than what we ended up getting for Cartoon Crisis 2. So anyway, Blue fails to get into trouble, so he has to eat the supper all by himself. Yeah, he's the only person that he has to eat what Frankie made, all because he didn't get into trouble and the other characters are punished by Mr. Hellman. Tell me, do you really think that Blue actually deserves this all because Frankie put through a lot of stress and Mr. Hellman's character addiction along with other things going on in this episode? No, not even close. If Blue deserves to be punished, it has to be in the episode where he actually did something terrible with the other characters that wasn't in his full motivations. Seriously. Whenever I completely see Blue being punished in this and the fact that it just cuts to the next scene, it just goes to show that the creators of this episode honestly tries way too hard to have Blue be punished, but at the same time, it's too late and it's done poorly done. And believe me, Madame Foster in this episode, it really goes to show how much she is two-faced in this. Sometimes she's a good elderly person, but other times she's just a terrible person. And don't worry, I am going to talk about that episode in the following month. All in all, this episode was just painful to sit through. And for any of my subscribers who requested me to review this episode, this was a long time coming, but I can really tell you that reviewing Duchess of Wales was pretty much a better choice compared to what I made with this episode along with other episodes to review as part of Cartoon Crisis 2. And in my opinion, I honestly think that this episode just gets much more worse at the fact that other episodes can easily be described as one of the worst episodes from Foster's. But for this episode alone, it makes you completely insulted. When it comes to imposters and everyone knows it's Benny, it's considered amateurish to say the least. But in this episode, it's not even amateurish. It's actually really hard to take this episode seriously, wherever you completely see all of this being hammered in on having Blue gain his comeuppance for all the wrong reasons. You know, when people actually talk about some of the bad episodes that other people talk about from this show, it really goes to show how divided the fan base of this show really is, whether you completely look at the episodes later on. Seriously, this is one of the examples on why the earlier seasons of this show is easily overshadowed, and in my opinion, it just gets a lot more frustrating whenever you completely look at this episode once you get older. Because once I watched this episode back then, I really did not like it, but seeing that there were other people despising this episode, it really goes to show that I'm not the only one, despite the fact that I did not despise it. Anyway, I give this episode a 3 out of 10, and there's only one more review to culminate Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends week. And it's something that I save for best for last, which is actually a good thing, because if we end off with this week with this episode, it will lead to a bad taste in our mouths.
Let's get this started again. Me and my whole crew.